great. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Andy Cutting, and I work for the National Autistic Society, and I run the School Exclusion Service, which has been running for the last 5 years. So we aim to support parents and carers of autistic children and young people who've been excluded from school or are at risk of exclusion from school. I'm just going to start by saying that autism is not a mental health condition. Autism is a lifelong developmental disability that affects how an individual communicates and relates to other people and how they experience the world. But autistic people are much more likely to develop mental health conditions as a result of the difficulties that they face. Low self-esteem and a tendency to think of threats as being greater than they really are can lead to increased stress and anxiety. Many autistic children find it very difficult to describe how they're feeling and to describe their symptoms, but sudden changes in their behaviour can indicate that they have an anxiety disorder, and an anxiety disorder can then lead to depression. Now today I'm going to talk to you about school exclusion, which is my particular interest. I'll talk about the reasons for exclusion, the official reasons given by head teachers, also the reasons relating to the child's autism, the impact of exclusion on autistic children, and then I'm just going to signpost a few sources of information that you may find useful, hopefully. So, all autistic people share, to a greater or a lesser extent, differences, the following differences. So, social communication, social interaction, repetitive behaviours and routines, highly focused interests, and sensory sensitivities. Now, those differences, and I use that word intentionally, those differences can be viewed in a positive way, I think particularly by autistic people themselves. If we take Chris Packham, for example, who's the TV presenter, he's made a very successful career out of his special interest of wildlife. So what is it about school life that turns those differences into difficulties? Now, I could list thousands of different situations, but I've just picked a few just by way of example. So, autistic children often find it difficult coping with the unstructured times of days, so break times, lunch times, and so on. They can find navigating the social world of the playground utterly bewildering. Autistic children can take things very literally, so they can find it very hard to relate to other teenagers with their banter, their sarcasm and dares. And also when a teacher leans over an autistic child's desk and says, "Am I boring you?" the autistic child is likely to say, "Yes, you are." But that's part of their autism. Sudden changes to their routine can cause high anxiety, particularly arriving at school and finding there's a supply teacher taking their class. Appearing rude, calling out, correcting the teacher doesn't always go down very well. And sensory sensitivities can mean that the lights, the sound, the smells in a classroom can be overwhelming. So any one of those, or an accumulation of those triggers over the course of a day, a week, or even a term, can build up to what we commonly call an autistic meltdown. A huge overwhelming loss of control, and it's often violent in nature. But having spoken to thousands of parents over the last few years, they often tell me that their child has no recollection of the meltdown at all. And when they find out that their child when the child finds out that they've hurt their teaching assistant, for example, they can be very upset and full of remorse. However, when a head teacher gets wind of an instance that's been violent of this kind, the first reaction may be to exclude that child. But what effects does exclusion have on an autistic pupil? Well, for some children, some autistic children, exclusion is like a golden ticket. They get sent home. They go back to their familiar surroundings, their safe place. So what exclusion does in those situations is that it reinforces the negative behaviour. For other autistic children, however, exclusion can heighten their sense of isolation. For a child who already feels that they don't really fit in at school, they don't have any friends, to have a letter sent home from the head teacher to their parents saying that you've been excluded for 5 days, I can only imagine that that feels like, for that child, an official confirmation, you are not welcome at our school. This can lead to a negative downward spiral. Further anxiety, isolation, depression, self-harm, and a significant number of parents have told me that as a direct result of exclusion, their child has had suicidal thoughts and feelings. The school might say, all behaviour is a choice. Some teachers might try and offer helpful advice and say, well, you could have put your hand up. You could have waited to the end of the class. You could have just ignored the other person. But to the autistic pupil, the only options they really have when they're in that heightened state of anxiety and stress is fight or flight. The flight is trying to run out of the classroom, run into the playground, to climb a tree, it's quite common, to climb over the fence, to try and run home. And if they can't do those things, they'll hide in the toilets, hide under a table. And if they're stopped from doing that, well-meaning staff intervening with their health and safety hats on, using physical restraint on the autistic child. For a child who has sensory sensitivities, that touch when they're in a heightened state and having adults crowding around them can actually make an incident much worse, and they become extremely violent then. So every time a head teacher excludes any pupil, they have to give the reason for that exclusion. Those statistics are collected nationally, and the most common reason for excluding an autistic pupil is physical assault against an adult. Just out of interest, for children who don't have special needs, physical assault against an adult falls way down the list. It's 6th most common, but for autistic children it's top. So are we saying that autistic children are rampaging around schools, targeting teachers and attacking them? Not at all. I was lucky enough to speak to a grandparent who summed up this misunderstanding really well, I think, and she gave me permission to share this with you. The school have painted Oscar as some sort of monster, instead of my grandson, who sleeps with 3 teddies, is scared of the dark, and doesn't eat anything with a face on it. So schools and parents can view the child in completely different ways. So to really understand why autistic pupils sometimes display challenging behaviour, you need to see the incident in the context, the broader context. A diagram that I often like to share with parents and schools is of an iceberg. So with the tip of the iceberg is the challenging behaviour. So that's the biting, the scratching, the kicking, throwing furniture, and that's the behaviour that the head teacher can see and reacts to by excluding. But underneath the water level are all the underlying impairments that are a direct consequence of that child's autism. If the school just reacts to the behaviour every time, you get this negative cycle of incident exclusion, and that can ultimately end in permanent exclusion. I often think that autistic pupils are like hamsters stuck in this wheel of punishment. Okay. Okay, so I'm running out of time here. So I'm going to skip down. Yep, I'll skip down here. So yeah, any head teacher should consider any contributing factors before excluding. So the guidance on exclusion says it should be, consider bullying, bereavement, and mental health issues. But for an autistic pupil, really the head teacher should consider whether the behaviour is a direct consequence of the child's autism, or at least triggered by difficulties that child faces. And if the school goes ahead and excludes, that can result in disability discrimination. I haven't got time to talk about that today, unfortunately. I'm just going to signpost quickly a few resources. We've got one which is called Steps to Avoid the Exclusion of Autistic Pupils. And incidentally, I'm going to sort of try and hold that up, because it's got my email address and phone number on there. If you're interested in any of these resources, I can send them to you, or you can just Google them. So, Steps to Avoid the Exclusion of Autistic Pupils. A common issue that we found is that schools will say that a particular child is coping fine at school, no problem at all, but when they get home, they're bouncing off the walls. So we've written a guide called School Stress and Anxiety, How It Can Lead to School Refusal and Impact on Family Life. Bit of a mouthful. And then another one, we would argue that exclusion does not improve the behaviour of autistic pupils. It does not provide a disincentive to behave in the same way again, because the behaviour is a direct consequence of the child's autism. So we've written Successful Reintegration of Autistic Pupils Following Exclusion. And then the final one, just very quickly, can I just say? This is a big thing for me, because I say this in every conversation I have with parents, is that when exclusion occurs, it can break down the relationship between home and school. Parents, understandably, want to go into meetings all guns blazing because they have a strong sense of injustice, which is true. But it's far better to work with the school. So I would recommend working together with your child's school by the Autism Education Trust, because it allows, it's basically a questionnaire, allows you to focus on three priorities for your child, and then arrange a meeting with the school, and it's a basis for a positive, constructive discussion about the child, rather than going in complaining the whole time. Okay, so as I say, if you want any of those resources, and obviously I said them very quickly, then by all means do just email me or to phone. That's the School Exclusions email address and the School Exclusions phone number. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I could have listened all day, sorry Andy. I'm going to read out that document there, just for everyone, and I'm going to ask for questions as well, okay? So if you are interested in that email, it's schoolexclusions@nas.org.uk. Phone number 0808 800 400 2.
Do we have any questions on the floor? Yes. Okay, I'm going to head to you and then head to you.
Yeah, just to add as well, apart from all the thousands of kids that are excluded who are autistic, there's also thousands of kids who are unable to attend school because of their anxiety, and they're not excluded. They're still on roll. The numbers still show that they're at school, but they're not, because they can't cope with the school environment. For whatever reason, their anxiety is too high, and there's no alternative placement for them. And you have to go to the hell that is the HCP. And all those kids get missed because they're not on staff, and it's just to make people aware there are thousands of kids who mask in school, who are really good in school, and they come home and totally melt down because they can't cope, especially girls. So just to add to the stats that you've already mentioned.
No, I agree completely with what you're saying there, because when an autistic child is under a lot of stress, they either go into meltdown or they go into shutdown. And that's when they go very quiet and aren't making any progress, and then you get the school refusal. So on our website we've got school refusal structures.
Really sorry to interrupt, but could I just not call it school refusal? Is that implies is that a choice for the child?
Okay.
Are they able to get to school because their anxiety is through the roof? I hate refusal, sorry.
Okay, that's fair enough. So we have got some information on our website on that issue, but also the one where I mentioned about school stress, that one relates to that issue as well.
Thank you. Yes.
In your experience, what level of support can schools give to children who are not formally diagnosed but who are going through the diagnosis process, which takes a very long time?
Well, it should all be about individual need. So So a child shouldn't necessarily need to have a diagnosis of autism to get some support. Having said that, it's a lot easier to access, for example, autism advisory service and all that sort of thing. But if they, you know, the guidance on exclusion says that disruptive behaviour can be an indication of unmet needs, and as such, there are some steps the school could be taking. And they're the steps that are outlined in that document I mentioned, steps to avoid the exclusion of autistic pupils. So one of those steps is for the school to make a request to the local authority for an assessment of the child's education and healthcare needs, which can in some cases lead to an education and healthcare plan. But before we even get to that stage, there's things the school should be doing. If they consider the child to be disabled under the Section 6 Equality Act, they should be making reasonable adjustments for that child. Because if they aren't able to take part in normal day-to-day activities, for example, it might be the school agreeing with the parent, say yes, we should be making adjustments for this child.
Thank you. Next question?
I'm very interested from a work perspective, but also I've got a son who wasn't diagnosed until he was 21, despite years and years of acute mental health. How would you feel mental health services can improve the way in which they interact with children who are suspected of being on the autistic spectrum? If somebody asked him how he felt, he didn't know how to answer. So for years and years and years, he got nothing out of mental health services because nobody spoke to him in the right way. It's only now, where he's having counselling from a specialist autistic counsellor, that he's actually getting anywhere, because he couldn't do the let's sit back and you just talk. So how can the whole system be improved so that when he was a master at school, he didn't ever get, didn't rise up. So how is it improved from the mental health support?
It's a tricky one. I mean, diagnosis is not really my field, I have to say. Our autism helpline probably can help with questions like that. But I mean, one common issue that we have is that hands will often wash their hands and say, like I said at the beginning, that autism is not a mental health condition, so they pass the child back. But then the child gets sort of swapped back and forth the whole time, nobody taking responsibility for the child. So that's an issue certainly that we come across. But certainly the way that the child is diagnosed should be sensitive to that child's needs. And you know, obviously a good diagnostician should be able to assess that child or that young person.
Thank you so much. We do actually have time for one last question. If anyone would like, thank you. Come there.
I just wanted to ask, you were talking about school refusal and how to avoid exclusion. I have a 14-year-old son who's currently on the school roll, but he starts to refuse to go to school. He just can't cope with it. And the school have, on one occasion, given him an informal exclusion, which I believe to be legal. I just wondered how as a parent I can deal with that issue. They couldn't cope with his behaviour, they had no safe place for him to go to, and they asked me to go and pick him up. What do I do in that situation? Because obviously they have a responsibility to educate my son and keep him safe, but they should also have provisions for him when he can't cope with the environment. What do I do?
Well, you can refuse to collect him because unless it's an official exclusion, there would be no basis for taking him home, unless he were ill. But even then, it's not for the school to diagnose and say, oh, your child's ill. It's got to be your opinion really there. So unless every exclusion has to be backed up with an official letter from the head teacher with all the details. If you don't get that, it is an unofficial exclusion, which is unlawful. So if that's happened, you can write to the governors of the school and complain. Ambitious About Autism, the charity, have got some really good information. They've got some letter templates written by a solicitor, which I think are really good, about informal exclusion, so that's good. They're not allowed to exclude your son for a non-disciplinary reason. So if they feel they can't cope, or they lack resources or expertise, they're not allowed to exclude him on that basis. It's only for disciplinary reasons. But they've also got to make reasonable adjustments for him as well in terms of the behaviour policy. So that means they can be flexible and say, well, actually, normally we would exclude for this, but because we can see that your son's behaviour is linked to his autism, we're not going to exclude.
Andy, it's an absolute pleasure. Round of applause, please. Thank you.